During the 3 days between Thomas's funeral and the family meeting that would change everything, I lived in a strange state of suspended animation. I moved through our house, my house, like a ghost, touching objects that suddenly seemed like artifacts from someone else's life. The coffee mug Thomas drank from every morning, the chair where he read his newspaper, the side of the bed where he slept. All of it felt like evidence of a relationship I'd thought I understood, but that had apparently been something completely different. I kept finding myself in front of the mirror in our bedroom, staring at my reflection and trying to see what Thomas had seen when he looked at me during those final years. Was I really the emotionally distant, intellectually limited woman he'd described to Celeste? Had I become so comfortable, so predictable, so much like wallpaper that he'd stopped seeing me as a real person with real feelings and real worth? I thought about our last conversation, the night before he died. Thomas had been struggling with pain management, and I'd sat beside his hospital bed holding his hand while he dozed fitfully. When he woke up around midnight, he'd squeezed my hand and said, "Eleanor, I want you to know that you've been a good wife. You've done everything right. I'm sorry if I haven't always been the husband you deserved." At the time, those words had felt like a gift, a final expression of love and gratitude from a man who was facing death and wanted to make sure I knew how much our marriage had meant to him. But now I understood they had been something else entirely. They had been Thomas's attempt to assuage his guilt, to convince himself that he'd been kind to the woman he'd been systematically betraying for 5 years. "You've been a good wife. You've done everything right." Not, "I love you." Not, "You're the most important person in my life." Not, "I can't imagine my life without you." Just acknowledgement that I'd been adequate, that I'd fulfilled my duties competently, that I'd done what was expected of me even though what I'd given him hadn't been enough to make him happy. "I'm sorry if I haven't always been the husband you deserved." Even his apology had been carefully crafted to avoid admitting specific wrongdoing. Not, "I'm sorry I lied to you." Not, "I'm sorry I built a secret life with another woman." Not, "I'm sorry I let our children believe you were inadequate so they'd support my affair." Just a vague expression of regret that could mean anything or nothing, depending on how much I actually knew about what he'd done. Those 3 days gave me time to process not just Thomas's betrayal, but the full scope of how thoroughly I'd been isolated within my own family. My children hadn't just supported their father's affair, they'd actively participated in creating a narrative that justified it. They'd accepted his characterization of me as emotionally limited, sexually frigid, intellectually shallow. They'd bought into his story that leaving me would be a kindness, that everyone would be happier once I'd been gracefully transitioned out of the central role I'd occupied for decades. What hurt most was realizing how easy it had apparently been for Thomas to convince them. Neither Michael nor Lillian had ever come to me to ask if I was unhappy in my marriage, if I felt disconnected from their father, if I wanted help working on problems they thought we were having. They'd simply accepted Thomas's version of events and begun treating me accordingly, with the kind of gentle condescension you'd show to someone who was too emotionally obtuse to understand her own situation. I started thinking about family gatherings over the past few years, conversations that had seemed normal at the time, but that took on different meanings now that I understood what everyone else had known. The way Michael had started asking me about my interests outside the marriage, as if he were a counselor helping me prepare for an inevitable divorce. The way Lillian had begun complimenting me on how independent I was becoming, how good it was to see me developing my own activities and friendships apart from Dad. They'd been preparing me for abandonment without my realizing it, gradually conditioning me to see myself as a separate individual rather than half of a married couple. Every suggestion that I join new clubs, take up new hobbies, spend more time with female friends had been part of a campaign to help me build an identity that didn't depend on Thomas, so that when he eventually left me for Celeste, I'd have something to fall back on. Even more painful was remembering the conversations we'd had about Thomas's health during his illness. Both Michael and Lillian had insisted on being involved in his medical care in ways that had seemed loving and supportive at the time, but that I now understood had been about maintaining control over information flow. They'd wanted to make sure they knew what Thomas's doctors were saying, what his prognosis was, what treatments were available, so they could help him manage the practical aspects of transitioning from being married to me to being with Celeste. There had been family meetings about Thomas's care that I'd been excluded from, supposedly to spare me additional stress during an already difficult time. Michael and Lillian had met with Thomas's oncologist to discuss quality of life issues and end-of-life planning while I was at home preparing meals. Thomas might be able to keep down and researching alternative treatments that might help him feel stronger. I'd thought they were being thoughtful, taking some of the burden off me during a time when I was already stretched thin between my roles as caregiver, household manager, and emotional support system, but they'd actually been planning for a future that didn't include me as Thomas's primary decision-maker or next of kin. They'd been preparing to transfer Thomas's care from his wife to his girlfriend, making sure all the legal and medical groundwork was in place for when that transition became necessary. The will that Celeste had shown me during our family meeting hadn't been created in isolation. It had been part of a comprehensive plan that included changing medical directives, updating insurance beneficiaries, transferring financial assets, and preparing our children to support Thomas's new life arrangements. Everyone had been working together to orchestrate my systematic replacement, while I'd been focused on being the best wife and caregiver I could be during what I thought were our final months together. By the time I sat down with James Morrison on Monday morning, I had a clear understanding of what I was fighting for. This wasn't just about money or property or legal technicalities. This was about refusing to let my life's work be erased, my contributions be minimized, my worth be determined by people who had systematically devalued me for years. James's office felt like a sanctuary. Wood-paneled walls lined with law books, heavy furniture that suggested permanence and stability, an environment where facts mattered more than feelings, and where legal documents carried more weight than emotional manipulations. James himself was exactly what I needed, a man in his 60s who had been practicing estate law for decades, and who understood that beneath every family dispute about money was a deeper conflict about respect, recognition, and the right to be treated with dignity. "Eleanor, he said, settling behind his desk, with the file that contained all our estate planning documents. "Before we discuss the specifics of Thomas's will, I want you to understand something important. You've been married for 43 years. You were listed as joint owner on virtually all your marital assets. Regardless of what anyone else thinks Thomas wanted or promised, the law is very clear about what belongs to you and what rights you have as his surviving spouse." He opened the file and spread out copies of documents I recognized. The will Thomas had signed in his office 3 years earlier, property deeds that showed joint ownership of our house, bank signature cards that established my equal access to our accounts, insurance policies that named me as primary beneficiary. The will that someone showed you, the one allegedly leaving most of Thomas's assets to his girlfriend, that document has several serious legal problems, James continued. First, it wasn't properly witnessed. Second, it attempts to dispose of assets that Thomas didn't legally own independently. Third, it conflicts with beneficiary designations that were established years earlier and that would require your consent to change. James pulled out a calculator and began running numbers based on our financial statements. Even if that newer will were legally valid, which it isn't, it would only govern Thomas's separate property. Based on these records, Thomas's separate property consisted of approximately $1,800 in a checking account he maintained for personal expenses, his clothing and personal effects, and a small collection of tools and sporting goods. $1,800. After 43 years of marriage, after building a comfortable retirement fund and paying off our mortgage and accumulating all the financial security that had allowed Thomas to maintain his secret apartment and his secret relationship, his independent assets amounted to $1,800. Everything else, the house, the investment accounts, the savings, the life insurance policies, those are marital assets that belong to you regardless of what Thomas put in any will, James explained. He didn't have the legal right to give away property that wasn't entirely his to dispose of. I felt something inside me relax for the first time since Thomas's funeral. Not relief exactly, but a kind of vindication, confirmation that my instincts had been correct, that the law recognized what Thomas and my children and Celeste had tried to deny. I wasn't some inconvenient obstacle to be managed around. I was Thomas's legal spouse with legal rights that couldn't be wished away or rewritten by people who found my existence inconvenient. "But James," I said, "what about the money Thomas spent on Celeste? The apartment, the vacations, the gifts. Doesn't that complicate things?" James's expression grew serious. "That money was taken from marital assets without your knowledge or consent. Technically, it's a debt that the estate owes to you. If Thomas had lived and you'd divorced, you could have sued for reimbursement of those funds. Since he's deceased, you can recover them from his estate, which means, practically speaking, that Celeste will need to return anything of value she received or pay back the money Thomas spent on her behalf." The scope of what James was telling me began to sink in. Not only was I entitled to keep everything Thomas had tried to give away, but I could also reclaim everything he'd spent on his affair. The apartment lease payments, the vacation costs, the jewelry, the dinners, the gifts, all of it could be calculated and recovered as marital funds that had been improperly diverted. How much are we talking about? If what? I asked. James consulted the financial analysis I'd prepared with the forensic accountant's help. Based on these records, approximately $97,000 over 5 years. That includes rent payments for the apartment, travel expenses, jewelry purchases, restaurant charges, and various gifts and personal expenses. $97,000, nearly $100,000 of our retirement savings had been spent on Thomas's girlfriend, while I'd been carefully budgeting our household expenses and worrying about whether we had enough savings to cover potential long-term care costs as we aged. There's something else you should know, James said, and his tone became even more serious. I received a call last week from an attorney representing Celeste. He was asking about probate procedures and estate valuations, clearly operating under the assumption that she was Thomas's primary beneficiary. When I told him that you were the surviving spouse and primary beneficiary, he seemed surprised. Someone had hired an attorney for Celeste. Someone had been so confident in their plan to transfer Thomas's assets to his girlfriend that they'd already begun legal proceedings to make it happen. They hadn't just been hoping I'd go along with their arrangements. They'd been actively working to legally formalize the transfer of my property to another woman. Do you know who hired the attorney? I asked. James shook his head. The attorney wouldn't say, but based on his questions and his level of knowledge about Thomas's assets, I would guess it was someone with detailed information about your family's finances. Someone who knew enough to believe they could successfully challenge Thomas's legal will. Someone who knew about our finances. Someone who had enough information to develop a legal strategy. Someone who had been confident enough to hire an attorney before Thomas was even buried. Michael. It had to be Michael, who had power of attorney during Thomas's final illness, who had access to all our financial records, who had been helping Thomas manage his affairs during the months when Thomas was too sick to handle things himself. Michael, who worked in finance and who understood legal documents well enough to believe he could orchestrate this property transfer successfully. My son had been planning to give my life savings to his father's girlfriend. My son had been working with attorneys to make it happen. My son had been so convinced of my inadequacy, so certain that I didn't deserve the assets I'd helped build, that he'd hired legal representation to fight against my interests. The betrayal was so complete, so systemic, so carefully planned that I felt dizzy trying to process it all. This hadn't been a spontaneous decision made in the immediate aftermath of Thomas's death. This had been a long-term strategy developed while Thomas was still alive, with his knowledge and participation, designed to ensure that when he died, everything would be transferred smoothly to Celeste, while I was left with whatever scraps they decided to throw my way. What do I need to do? I asked James. First, we file the correct will for probate and establish you as the executor of Thomas's estate, he said. Second, we send a formal notice to Celeste's attorney explaining that she has no legal claim to marital assets and that any property or funds she received from Thomas will need to be returned. Third, we prepare documentation of all the financial transfers made without your consent, so we can recover those funds through the estate. James paused and looked at me directly. Eleanor, I want you to understand that this is going to be unpleasant. Your family members who supported Thomas's arrangements are going to be angry when they realize their plans aren't going to work. They may say hurtful things, make accusations, try to pressure you into accepting less than you're legally entitled to. Are you prepared for that kind of conflict? I thought about the woman in the black Chanel suit, crying harder than I was at my own husband's funeral. I thought about my children guiding me to the third row like I was some distant relative who needed to be managed carefully. I thought about Thomas's final words to me, carefully crafted to sound loving, while actually saying goodbye to a woman he'd been systematically replacing for 5 years. James, I said, I've been prepared for this fight longer than I realized. I just didn't know I was going to have to fight it alone against my own family. The next morning, I called Michael and Lillian and invited them to lunch at our house on Saturday. I didn't mention Celeste, didn't mention legal proceedings, didn't hint at what I'd discovered about their plans. I just said I'd been thinking about some practical matters related to their father's estate and thought it would be good for us to discuss them together as a family. Both of them agreed immediately, probably relieved that I was finally ready to address practical matters, and assuming I was calling to discuss the details of how Thomas's assets would be transferred to Celeste. They probably thought this was the conversation where I'd gracefully accept my reduced role and agree to whatever financial arrangements they'd worked out on my behalf. Instead, it was going to be the conversation where they learned that stealing from your mother is still stealing, even when you convince yourself you're doing it for noble reasons. It was going to be the conversation where they discovered that love without respect is just elaborate exploitation, and that underestimating someone for 43 years doesn't mean they'll stay underestimated forever. The night before our family meeting, I made Thomas's favorite cake again, the same recipe I'd been making for special occasions throughout our marriage, the same cake I'd made for his birthday parties and anniversary celebrations and holiday gatherings. But this time I wasn't making it as an act of love or service or tradition. I was making it as a reminder of exactly what 43 years of marriage looks like in practical terms, what kind of accumulated knowledge and care and attention to detail was being dismissed so casually by people who had decided I didn't matter anymore. I set the table with our good china, the dishes we'd received as wedding gifts and had used for every important family meal for 4 decades. I arranged fresh flowers from the garden Thomas and I had planted together, flowers I'd continued to tend during his illness, while he was spending his healthy days with another woman. I put out cloth napkins and real silverware and the crystal glasses we'd bought for our 10th anniversary. I wanted everything to look perfect, to reflect the standards I'd maintained for our family throughout our marriage, to demonstrate the level of care and attention I'd brought to our shared life, even during the periods when Thomas had apparently been describing me as emotionally distant and intellectually limited. Most importantly, I wanted my children to sit in the dining room where they'd grown up, surrounded by evidence of the stable, loving home their mother had created for them, while they tried to explain why they'd decided that home and that mother were worth less than their father's girlfriend's feelings. The woman in the black Chanel suit was crying harder than I was, and she was sitting in my seat, at my husband's funeral, in the front row where I should have been, where I'd sat beside Thomas for 43 years of marriage through countless other funerals, christenings, graduations. But there she was, this stranger with her perfectly styled auburn hair and designer grief, clutching a tissue like it was the most precious thing in the world, while my own children, my own flesh and blood, guided me to the third row like I was some distant relative who'd shown up uninvited. That was the moment I knew, not suspected, not wondered, but knew with the kind of bone-deep certainty that settles in your chest like the tip of a needle, sharp and impossible to ignore. The moment I realized that everything I thought I understood about my life, my marriage, my family, had been carefully constructed around a lie so massive it took my breath away. And what made it worse, what made it feel like swallowing broken glass, was seeing my son Michael's hand on this woman's shoulder, protective and gentle, while he couldn't even meet my eyes. You have to understand, I'd been feeling like something was off for months before Thomas died. Little things that didn't quite add up, like how he'd started working late every Tuesday and Thursday, how he'd become protective of his phone in a way that felt new after 4 decades together, how he'd suddenly developed strong opinions about restaurants I'd never heard him mention. There were the new cologne habits, Thomas, who had worn the same aftershave for 20 years, suddenly experimenting with different scents. There were the mysterious phone calls he'd taken in the garage, claiming they were work-related even though he'd been retired for 3 years. There were the credit card charges I couldn't account for, flowers from expensive florists, dinners at restaurants we'd never been to together, hotel charges in cities where Thomas claimed to be visiting his old army buddy Frank, except when I called Frank to ask how the visit had gone, Frank had no idea what I was talking about. But when you've been married as long as we had, you learn to trust the foundation you've built together. You tell yourself that everyone changes as they get older, that people develop new interests, new routines, new needs you might not immediately understand. You explain away the inconsistencies because the alternative, that your husband of 4 decades is living a double life, seems so absurd, so impossible, so completely at odds with the man who still brought you coffee in bed every Sunday morning and who still reached for your hand when you walked together. I remember the first time I found a receipt in his jacket pocket for jewelry I'd never seen. A necklace from Tiffany's that cost more than we usually spent on Christmas gifts for both our children combined. When I asked Thomas about it, he got that slightly panicked look that I'd learned to recognize over the years. The same expression he'd had when the kids were little and he'd forgotten about parent-teacher conferences or birthday parties. He said it was an early anniversary gift for me, that he'd been planning a surprise but I'd ruined it by being too curious. He seemed so genuinely flustered, so disappointed that his surprise had been spoiled, that I felt guilty for questioning him at all. The necklace never appeared. Our anniversary came and went with the usual dinner at our usual restaurant and the usual exchange of cards and modest gifts. When I mentioned the necklace weeks later, Thomas looked at me with genuine confusion, as if I'd made the whole thing up. "What necklace?" he said. "Eleanor, I think you might be getting confused. Are you feeling all right? Maybe you should make an appointment with Dr. Rodriguez, just to make sure everything's okay with your memory. That was the beginning of what I now understand was a systematic campaign to make me doubt my own perceptions, my own memory, my own understanding of what was happening in my own marriage. Every time I questioned something that didn't make sense, Thomas would express concern about my mental state, my stress levels, my ability to keep track of things accurately. He'd suggest gently that maybe I was overworking myself with my volunteer activities, maybe I needed to slow down, maybe the changes that come with aging were affecting me more than I wanted to admit. And I believed him, because that's what you do when you love someone and trust them completely. You assume that if there's a disconnect between what you think you're seeing and what they're telling you, the problem is probably with your perception, not with their honesty. You assume that the person who's shared your bed and your life and your most intimate thoughts for 43 years wouldn't systematically lie to you about fundamental aspects of his daily existence. The phone calls were what finally made me start keeping track of things in writing. Thomas would get calls at odd hours, early morning, late evening, during dinner, and he'd always step outside to take them, claiming it was work-related business that couldn't wait. But Thomas had been retired from his job at the utility company for 3 years. What kind of work emergency requires a retired meter reader to have urgent phone conversations at 8 o'clock at night? I started writing down the dates and times of these calls, along with whatever explanation Thomas offered. By the end of 6 months, I had a notebook full of inconsistencies that were impossible to explain away as memory problems or stress-related confusion. Phone calls from his supervisor, who apparently didn't know Thomas had retired. Emergency meetings with colleagues who, when I ran into them at the grocery store, mentioned they hadn't seen Thomas in months. Business trips to handle equipment issues in cities where the utility company had no facilities. The credit card statements were where the pattern became undeniable. Thomas had always been terrible with money. He was the kind of man who thought balancing a checkbook was some sort of advanced mathematics that was beyond his capabilities. I'd been managing our finances since the second year of our marriage, when I discovered he'd bounced 6 checks in a single month because he couldn't keep track of what he'd spent. So I reviewed every statement, categorized every expense, maintained detailed budgets that had allowed us to pay off our house early and build a comfortable retirement fund. But starting about 5 years before Thomas died, there were charges I couldn't categorize, expenses that didn't fit into any of our normal spending patterns. Restaurants in parts of town we never visited, gas stations near an apartment complex where we knew no one, charges at a women's clothing store where I'd never shopped. When I asked Thomas about these expenses, he'd always have an explanation that sounded reasonable in the moment but fell apart under closer examination. The restaurant charges were business dinners with potential consulting clients. Thomas, who had never done consulting work in his life and had no expertise that anyone would pay to access. The gas station charges were from when he'd gotten lost driving to visit his sister, except his sister lived 20 minutes away on roads he'd been traveling for decades, and the gas station was in the opposite direction. The clothing store charges were for gifts for me, except I never received any gifts from that store, and when I called to ask about the purchases, they couldn't find any record of items being held or delivered to our address. I started making copies of everything: credit card statements, bank records, phone bills, receipts I found in Thomas's pockets or car. I kept them in a folder hidden in my sewing room, telling myself I was being paranoid but unable to stop collecting evidence of something I couldn't quite name. I felt like I was investigating my own husband, which seemed both necessary and completely insane. The breaking point came 8 months before Thomas died, when I answered his phone while he was in the shower and heard a woman's voice say, "Hi, honey, I was just calling to confirm our dinner reservation for tonight. Should I meet you at the restaurant, or do you want to pick me up at the apartment?" When I said Thomas wasn't available, there was a long pause, and then the woman said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I think I have the wrong number," and hung up. But she'd called Thomas by name before I'd said anything. She'd known exactly who she was calling. She'd had dinner reservations with my husband, and she'd mentioned an apartment I knew nothing about. That night, when Thomas said he was going to his monthly poker game with the guys from his old job, I followed him. I sat in my car in the parking lot of a restaurant I'd never heard of and watched my husband of 42 years have dinner with a woman I'd never seen before. I watched him hold her hand across the table, watched him lean in to listen when she spoke, watched him kiss her goodbye in a way that made it clear this wasn't a new development. I sat in that parking lot for 2 hours after they left, trying to process what I'd seen, trying to figure out how to confront Thomas about it, trying to understand how my marriage had become something I no longer recognized. I thought about all the signs I'd noticed and dismissed, all the explanations I'd accepted, all the times I'd questioned my own perceptions instead of trusting what I was seeing with my own eyes. When Thomas came home that night, he told me all about his poker game, who had won, who had lost, what they'd talked about, how late they'd stayed out. He was a good storyteller, convincing in his details, plausible in his timeline. If I hadn't just watched him have dinner with another woman, I would have believed every word. The woman, I learned later her name was Celeste because of course it was something elegant and ethereal, wasn't just crying. She was performing grief, the kind of dramatic mourning that comes with practiced gestures and perfectly timed sobs. She had a folded program pressed against her heart, and I could see from where I was banished that she'd written something in the margins, something that made her press her lips together and close her eyes like she was holding back secrets too precious to share with the rest of us, mere mortals. My daughter Lillian was the one who'd physically moved me. Not roughly, but with that kind of firm guidance you use with elderly relatives who might not understand the situation. "Mom," she'd whispered, her breath warm against my ear but her words cold as January, "we need you to sit back here today. There are some complicated family dynamics, and we thought it would be better, more peaceful, if you gave Celeste some space to grieve." Complicated family dynamics. Space to grieve. As if I wasn't the woman who'd held Thomas's head when he threw up from chemotherapy, who'd learned to give him insulin shots because his fingers shook too badly to do it himself, who'd slept in that uncomfortable hospital chair for 6 weeks while he fought pneumonia 2 years ago. As if I hadn't been the one to sign the DNR papers when the doctors said there was nothing more they could do, making the hardest decision of my life, while this Celeste woman was probably somewhere picking out her funeral outfit and practicing her devastated widow expression in the mirror. But I sat in that third row and I watched, and I listened, and I began to piece together exactly how thoroughly I'd been erased from my own life. Because that's what they'd done. Not just hidden Thomas's affair, but systematically written me out of the story of our marriage, our family, our shared history. The funeral program listed Thomas as beloved husband to Celeste, devoted father to Michael and Lillian. Not ex-husband to me, not father to children he'd had with another woman first. Just this clean, simple narrative where I apparently had never existed at all. The pastor, Reverend Williams, who had officiated our wedding 43 years ago, spoke about Thomas's love for Celeste as if it were the great romance of the century. How they'd met 5 years ago and known immediately they were soulmates. How Thomas had told him that meeting Celeste had made him feel alive again after years of feeling emotionally dead. How their love had been so pure, so powerful, that Thomas had said it was like finally coming home after a lifetime of wandering in the wilderness. Years of feeling emotionally dead. A lifetime of wandering in the wilderness. That's what our 43-year marriage had been to him, apparently. All those anniversaries where he'd held my hand and told me I was his anchor, his safe harbor, his greatest blessing. Just empty words he'd said to keep me quiet and compliant while he built his real life somewhere else. Michael stood up to give the eulogy, and I watched my son, my baby who I'd rocked through colic and taught to tie his shoes and helped through his divorce 3 years ago, speak about his father's courage in finally finding true love. How proud he was that Thomas had been brave enough to follow his heart even late in life. How Celeste had brought out a joy in Thomas that Michael had never seen before. How the family was committed to honoring Thomas's wishes and making sure Celeste felt supported and loved during this difficult transition. The family. As if I wasn't part of it anymore. As if I'd been voted out of my own life by some committee I didn't know existed. Lillian spoke next, and her words cut even deeper because I could hear the guilt underneath her carefully practiced speech. She talked about how Thomas had asked them to take care of Celeste, how he'd worried about leaving her alone in the world, how he'd made them promise to treat her like family because she was the love of his life and deserved their protection and support. Lillian's voice cracked when she said that Thomas had been the happiest she'd ever seen him these past 5 years, how Celeste had given him a reason to wake up excited about each day. The past 5 years. The same 5 years when I'd thought we were enjoying our golden years together, traveling to see grandchildren, planning the garden expansion Thomas had been so excited about, talking about maybe getting a little place in Florida for winters. All of that had been happening while he was living a completely separate life with another woman, telling our children that I'd made him emotionally dead, convincing them that his happiness required my erasure. But here's what they didn't know, what Thomas had never bothered to find out in all his careful planning and secret keeping. I wasn't the naive, financially helpless woman he'd apparently described to everyone. I'd been managing our money for decades because Thomas couldn't balance a checkbook to save his life. I knew exactly what we owned, what we owed, and what was legally mine regardless of what anyone else thought they deserved. More importantly, I knew about the will. The real will, not whatever documents Celeste and my children thought they were working with. 3 years ago, when Thomas first started acting strangely, I'd insisted we update our estate planning. I'd sat in that lawyer's office and listened to Thomas confirm that everything should go to me, his legal wife, with provisions for the children only after my death. I had copies of everything in my safe deposit box, along with 43 years of marriage certificates, tax returns, property deeds, and bank statements that told the real story of our shared life. Thomas had signed those papers in front of me, in front of the lawyer, with witnesses present. Legal, binding, unshakable papers that made me his primary beneficiary and executor. Whatever fantasy documents Celeste might have, whatever promises my children thought they were honoring, they were about to discover that betrayal has consequences, and that underestimating me had been their first and most costly mistake. After the service, I watched the receiving line with the kind of detached fascination you might have watching a movie about someone else's life. Person after person approached Celeste with condolences, telling her how sorry they were for her loss, how beautiful the service had been, how Thomas would have been so moved by the turnout. My friends, women I'd known for decades, were hugging this stranger and offering her their support during this difficult time. Mrs. Henderson from our book club actually said to Celeste, "I hope you know that Thomas talked about you constantly. He was so proud of the life you two had built together." Mrs. Henderson, who had been in my living room just 2 months ago drinking coffee and discussing our latest novel selection, who had listened to me worry about Thomas's health and stress levels, who had helped me plan his surprise birthday party last year. I realized then that this wasn't just an affair that had been hidden from me. This was a complete alternate reality that everyone else had been living in, while I'd been kept in the dark like some character in a play who didn't know her lines had been changed. My husband, my children, my friends, my community, they had all collectively decided that Celeste was Thomas's real wife and I was just some inconvenient detail that needed to be managed carefully. The burial was worse. At the graveside, Celeste was given the flag that had covered Thomas's casket. Thomas, who had served 3 years in the Army before we met, whose service I'd been proud of throughout our marriage, whose veterans' benefits I'd helped him navigate when he needed them. She was handed the flag like she was his widow, like she was the one who'd earned the right to that honor through decades of love and sacrifice and partnership. Michael stepped forward and put his arm around Celeste's shoulders as the minister said the final prayers. Lillian stood on her other side, creating this perfect tableau of family support, while I stood alone behind them like I was watching strangers bury someone I'd never met. The three of them had formed their own unit, their own version of family that didn't include the woman who had actually been Thomas's wife, who had actually earned the right to be the center of this moment. But I let them have their moment. I let them think they'd successfully orchestrated this transition, this passing of the torch from the old wife to the new one. I let them believe that I was too shocked, too grief-stricken, too old and confused to understand what was happening or to fight back effectively. Because the truth was, I was already 10 steps ahead of them, and my shock wasn't about Thomas's betrayal. It was about how little they'd thought of me, how thoroughly they'd underestimated the woman who had been managing the practical details of our family life for 43 years. That evening, I sat in my kitchen, the kitchen I'd designed and paid for with money from the inheritance my father left me, in the house that was in both our names, but that I could prove I'd contributed more toward than Thomas ever had, and I made a list. Not a vengeful list, not an angry list, but a practical, methodical inventory of exactly what needed to be done to protect myself and reclaim what was legally mine. First, I called James Morrison, our estate attorney, James who had drawn up that will 3 years ago, who had watched Thomas sign it, who had his copy locked away in his office safe. "James Viquez," I said when he answered, "I think we may have a problem. Thomas died yesterday, and I'm getting the impression that some people think there's a different will than the one we executed in your office." The silence on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know. James had been contacted. Someone, probably Michael, had already called him asking about Thomas's estate, expecting a different outcome than what the legal documents actually said. "Eleanor," James said carefully, "I think you and I should meet first thing Monday morning. And Eleanor, don't sign anything, don't agree to anything, and don't let anyone pressure you into making any decisions about the estate until we've talked." Second, I called Patricia, my best friend who'd navigated her own husband's betrayal. Patricia who'd learned the hard way that when men create secret lives, they often create secret financial arrangements to go with them. "Patricia," I said, "I need the name of that forensic accountant you used, the one who found all of David's hidden assets." "Oh, honey," Patricia said, and I could hear her getting her purse, already looking for the business card. I was wondering when you were going to call. I saw the obituary. I saw what they did to you at that funeral. That woman has no idea what she's gotten herself into, does she? Third, I called the bank. Our bank, where Thomas and I had maintained joint accounts for 4 decades, where I was listed as an equal owner on everything, where my signature was on file, where I had every legal right to know exactly what had been happening with our money. It's amazing what you can learn when you ask the right questions and you have the legal standing to demand answers. The picture that emerged over the next few days was both worse and better than I'd expected. Worse, because Thomas had indeed been living a completely double life, maintaining a separate apartment for Celeste, taking her on vacations I'd known nothing about, buying her jewelry and gifts with money he'd hidden in accounts I hadn't known existed. He'd been playing loving husband to me while playing devoted partner to her, somehow managing to keep both lives running parallel to each other for 5 years without either of us catching on completely. But better because Thomas had been an idiot about money, just like always. He'd hidden assets from me, yes, but he'd been sloppy about it. Transferring money from our joint accounts to his secret accounts, using our shared credit cards for Celeste's expenses, paying for their apartment with checks that created a paper trail leading directly back to our marital assets. Everything he'd spent on his secret life had been community property, which meant I had legal claim to all of it. More importantly, Thomas had never actually married Celeste. He'd let her believe they were common-law spouses, let everyone else believe she had some legal standing, but the truth was that I was his only legal wife, which meant that whatever promises he'd made to her, whatever expectations he'd set up, they had no legal weight against the will he'd signed 3 years ago making me his primary beneficiary. By Thursday, I had a complete financial picture and a strategy. By Friday, I had meetings scheduled with the forensic accountant and a second attorney who specialized in estate disputes, just to make sure I had all my bases covered. And by Saturday, exactly 1 week after Thomas's funeral, I was ready to reclaim my life. The family meeting was Michael's idea. He called me Saturday morning with that careful, gentle tone people use when they're about to deliver news they think will upset you, but that they believe is for your own good. "Mom, we need to talk about Dad's affairs, his final wishes. Celeste is ready to start handling his estate, and there are some decisions that need to be made. We thought it would be easier if we all sat down together and worked through everything calmly. Celeste is ready to start handling his estate." As if Thomas's actual widow, me, was just some minor stakeholder who needed to be consulted politely before the real decision-makers took over. "Of course, Michael," I said. "Why don't you all come here? To the house. We can use the dining room table. There will be paperwork to spread out." I spent Saturday afternoon preparing for that meeting like I was preparing for war. Which, I suppose I was. I laid out every document I'd collected, every bank statement, every legal paper, every piece of evidence that proved exactly who Thomas had been married to and exactly what belonged to whom under the law. I organized everything in neat folders with labels, like I was preparing a business presentation, because in many ways, that's exactly what this was. I also baked a coffee cake. Thomas's favorite recipe, one I'd been making for special occasions throughout our marriage. It seemed important to remind everyone exactly what 43 years of marriage looked like in practical terms, what kind of care and knowledge and shared history was being dismissed so casually. They arrived together Sunday afternoon, Michael, Lillian, and Celeste, who looked like she was dressed for a business meeting with someone she expected to intimidate. She wore a navy suit that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in a year, and she carried a leather portfolio that she set on my dining room table like she owned the place. "Eleanor," she said, extending her hand to me like we were meeting for the first time, "I want you to know how grateful I am that Thomas spoke of you so fondly. He always said you were a good woman who deserved to be treated with kindness." Spoken of me so fondly. Deserved to be treated with kindness. As if I were some ex-girlfriend from his distant past rather than the woman who'd shared his bed in his life and his last name for 4 decades. "Please sit down," I said, gesturing to the dining room chairs. "I've made coffee, and I've prepared some information that I think will help clarify things for everyone." Michael immediately took charge, which didn't surprise me. He'd always been the one to organize family discussions, to mediate between his father and sister when they disagreed about something. But today there was something different in his tone, something that sounded almost parental, as if he were the adult handling difficult children. "Mom, we know this is hard. We know you're probably feeling confused about Dad's arrangements, but he was very clear about his wishes, very specific about what he wanted to happen after he died. He wanted Celeste to be taken care of. He wanted his affairs handled smoothly, and he wanted everyone to be able to move forward without conflict. He left very detailed instructions, Lillian added, opening her own folder and spreading out papers I didn't recognize. He updated his will 2 years ago, made Celeste the primary beneficiary of his estate, and asked us to help facilitate the transition. He was worried about how you'd handle being on your own, so he made arrangements to make sure you'd be comfortable. Arrangements to make sure I'd be comfortable, like I was some elderly relative they needed to manage rather than the primary stakeholder in Thomas's estate. Celeste opened her portfolio and withdrew a document that she placed carefully in front of me. Thomas wanted you to have the house, Eleanor. He thought you'd be most comfortable staying where you've built your memories. The rest of his assets, the bank accounts, the investments, the insurance policies, those will come to me since we were planning to marry as soon as— She paused delicately. As soon as the situation allowed for it. I looked down at the document she'd given me. It was indeed a will, signed by Thomas, witnessed, notarized. It left me the house and a small monthly allowance, with everything else going to my beloved partner Celeste Morrison, who has brought joy and purpose to my final years. It was dated 18 months ago. This is very interesting, I said. Ik said, reachting for my own folder. Michael, Lillian, I'm curious. Did either of you actually witness your father signing this will? They looked at each other, then back at me. Mom, what do you mean? Lillian asked. I mean, were you physically present when he put his signature on this paper? Did you watch him do it? Well, no, Michael said, but Celeste was there. She witnessed it, and it's notarized. I see. I opened my folder and withdrew the will that James Morrison had drawn up 3 years ago. The real will, the legal will, the will that superseded anything Thomas might have signed later. This is also very interesting. This is the will your father signed in James Morrison's office 3 years ago, with James and his secretary as witnesses, making me his primary beneficiary and executor of his estate. The silence that followed was profound. I watched 3 faces process what they were seeing, watched them realize that their careful plans were about to crumble. That's impossible, Celeste said, but her voice had lost its confident edge. Thomas told me he'd changed everything. He showed me papers. Thomas showed you papers, I agreed. But Thomas wasn't a lawyer. Thomas barely understood the difference between a checking account and a savings account. What Thomas showed you was probably his own attempt to write down what he wanted to happen, but wanting something and making it legally binding are 2 very different things. I reached for the next folder. This is a complete financial disclosure prepared by our estate attorney and verified by a forensic accountant. It shows every asset Thomas and I own jointly, every account, every investment, every piece of property. It also shows the money Thomas transferred illegally from our joint accounts to pay for his relationship with you, Celeste. Money that belongs to our marital community property and that will need to be returned to the estate. Michael leaned forward, studying the papers I'd spread across the table. Mom, I don't understand. Dad said he'd taken care of everything. He said you'd be provided for, but that his main assets would go to Celeste because what, Michael? Because you'd had your turn. Because it was Celeste's time now. There it was. The ugly truth underneath all the gentle language and careful management. I'd had my turn, and now it was someone else's time. 43 years of marriage reduced to taking turns, like children sharing a toy. I see, Morisa, I said. And what did your father tell you about our marriage exactly? What did he say to convince you that I'd had my turn and should be gracefully stepping aside for his replacement? Lillian shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Mom, he said you'd grown apart. He said you'd been living like roommates for years, that there wasn't any real love left between you. He said meeting Celeste had made him realize what he'd been missing, what real partnership could feel like. He said you were a good woman, but that you'd never really understood him, Michael added. He said you'd been content with a surface-level relationship while he needed something deeper. I nodded slowly, taking this in. So that's how Thomas had justified it to himself, to our children, to his girlfriend. I was the shallow wife who'd never really understood him, content with surface-level connection, while he was a deep soul yearning for true understanding. It was a beautiful story, very romantic, very tragic. It was also complete fiction. Did it never occur to either of you to ask me about this? I asked. To check whether your father's version of our marriage matched my experience of it? They looked at each other again. Michael cleared his throat. We thought it would be hurtful to bring it up. We thought you might not realize how distant things had become. I might not realize, because I was too obtuse, too emotionally limited, too shallow to understand my own marriage. Well, I said, let me help you understand something. The will Celeste has is not legally binding because it wasn't properly executed. Even if it were valid, which it isn't, it would be superseded by the will your father signed 3 years later in the presence of proper witnesses. But more than that, and this is the part I think you're all going to find very interesting, Thomas never had the legal right to dispose of our assets the way he apparently thought he could. I opened the thickest folder and withdrew copies of property deeds, bank signature cards, investment accounts, insurance policies, everything your father owned. He owned jointly with me. Our house, our savings, our investments, his life insurance policies. I'm listed as joint owner and primary beneficiary on all of it, which means that regardless of what he put in any will, legal or otherwise, these assets pass directly to me by operation of law. Celeste had gone very pale. That can't be right. Thomas said he'd made me the beneficiary on his insurance policies. He said he'd added me to his bank accounts. Thomas said a lot of things, I replied gently. But saying something and doing it legally are different matters. Thomas may have filled out paperwork requesting beneficiary changes, but those changes would have required my consent as his spouse, and I never gave that consent because I was never asked for it. I reached for my phone and dialed James Morrison's office. He answered on the second ring, and I put the call on speaker. James, I have Michael, Lillian, and Celeste here with me, and we're discussing Thomas's estate. Could you please confirm for everyone what assets are covered by Thomas's will and what assets pass to me automatically as his surviving spouse? James's voice was crisp and professional. Certainly, Eleanor. Based on the will Thomas executed in my office and the joint ownership structure of your marital assets, Thomas's estate consists primarily of personal property and a small checking account he maintained independently. The house, the investment accounts, the savings accounts, and his life insurance policies all pass directly to you as the surviving joint owner or named beneficiary. The will governs the distribution of his personal effects in that single checking account. And what's the value of that checking account, James? Approximately $1,800. I thanked James and ended the call. The silence in my dining room was deafening. Finally, Celeste spoke, and her voice was barely a whisper. $1,800? But Thomas said, he told me there was over $400,000 in investments alone. There is, I said, and every penny of it belongs to me, just as it has for the past 43 years. Thomas had no legal right to promise it to you because Thomas never owned it independently. We built that nest egg together with my money and my financial management as much as his income. Michael was staring at the papers spread across the table like they were written in a foreign language. But Mom, what about what Dad wanted? What about his wishes? Your father's wishes, I said carefully, were to live a double life where he got to keep everything he'd built with me while also playing house with someone else. Your father's wishes were to have his cake and eat it too, with no consequences for anyone except me. Your father's wishes included erasing me from his funeral and handing over my life's work to a woman he'd known for 5 years. So forgive me if I'm not terribly concerned with honoring those particular wishes. Lillian was crying now, quiet tears that she kept wiping away with the back of her hand. Mom, I'm sorry, we didn't know. We thought Dad made it sound like I was some pathetic old woman who'd never really made him happy and should be grateful for whatever scraps you all decided to throw my way. We never meant to hurt you, Michael said. We thought we were helping. We thought we were doing what Dad wanted. What would be best for everyone? What would be best for everyone except me, you mean? The tears came harder then, from both of my children. Celeste just sat there looking stunned, like she was trying to process the complete collapse of everything she'd thought she knew about her life. I have one more thing to show you, I said, reaching for the final folder. This is a complete accounting of the money Thomas spent on his relationship with Celeste over the past 5 years. The apartment rent, the vacations, the jewelry, the dinners, the gifts, all of it paid for with marital assets that belonged to both of us. All of it money that was taken from our joint accounts without my knowledge or consent. I slid a summary sheet across the table. The total comes to just over $97,000. Money that legally belongs to me and that I'll be recovering from Celeste as a debt against the estate. Celeste's face went from pale to gray. I didn't know. Thomas never told me the money wasn't his to spend. I never would have accepted those things if I'd known. But you did know Thomas was married, I said quietly. You knew he had a wife, a family, a whole other life. You may not have known the financial details, but you knew you were participating in deception. I thought, he said you had an arrangement. He said you'd agreed to separate lives, that you were staying married for practical reasons, but that you both understood the marriage was over emotionally. Another beautiful story. Thomas, the tragic hero, trapped in a loveless marriage with a woman who'd agreed to stay for convenience while he found true love elsewhere. It was like a romance novel, very touching and very convenient for everyone, except the wife who'd actually been living the marriage. There was no arrangement, I said. There was no agreement. There was just a man who decided he wanted 2 lives and a family who decided to help him have them at my expense. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, giving them a moment to process everything while I put together a tray with coffee and the cake I'd baked. When I came back, they were huddled together whispering, probably trying to figure out if there was any way to salvage their plans. Here's what's going to happen, I said, serving coffee like we were having a pleasant family gathering. Celeste, you're going to vacate the apartment Thomas was paying for by the end of the month. You're going to return any jewelry or gifts that can be returned, and you're going to work with my attorney to establish a payment plan for the money that needs to be repaid to the estate. This doesn't have to be unpleasant, but it does have to happen. Celeste nodded mutely, still looking shell-shocked. Michael, Lillian, you're going to decide whether you want to be part of my life going forward or whether you want to continue believing your father's version of our marriage, because I won't be treated like some inconvenient old woman who should be grateful for whatever attention you decide to spare me. I'm your mother, I love you, and I'll always love you, but I won't be managed or patronized or erased from my own life. Mom, Lillian said through her tears, of course we want to be part of your life. We're so sorry. We made a terrible mistake. You made a choice, I corrected gently. Based on incomplete information, maybe, but still a choice. You chose to believe that I was less important than your father's girlfriend, that my 43 years of marriage counted for less than her 5 years of affair, that my grief mattered less than hers. Those were choices, not mistakes. Michael reached across the table and took my hand. How do we fix this? How do we make it right? You start by understanding that I'm not the woman your father described to you. I'm not shallow. I'm not emotionally limited. I'm not content with surface-level relationships. I'm a woman who spent 43 years loving a man who apparently saw that love as something he'd outgrown, something he was entitled to take for granted while he looked for something more exciting somewhere else. I'm a woman who discovered that her own children were willing to help rise her from her own life because they believed I didn't deserve better. I squeezed Michael's hand and then gently pulled mine away. I'm also a woman who's not going to disappear quietly just because it would be more convenient for everyone else. I'm going to live my life, I'm going to enjoy the resources I've spent decades building, and I'm going to decide for myself what I want my relationships with my children to look like going forward. The conversation continued for another hour, but the important parts were over. Celeste would be moving out, returning what could be returned, and establishing a payment plan for the rest. My children would be examining their assumptions about their parents' marriage and their own role in what had happened, and I would be reclaiming the life I'd almost allowed to be taken from me. After they left, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea and looked around at the space that was mine, that had always been mine, that I'd almost lost because everyone around me had decided I didn't deserve it. The furniture Thomas and I had chosen together, the photos of our family vacations, the books we'd collected, the art we'd bought over the years, all of it still here, still mine, still part of the life I'd built and that no one else had the right to give away. 3 months later, I sold the house. Not because I had to, not because anyone pressured me to, but because I realized I didn't want to live surrounded by memories of a marriage that had been more one-sided than I'd understood. I bought a smaller place closer to downtown, with a garden and a view of the mountains. I joined a hiking group, started taking art classes, began volunteering at the literacy center. Celeste moved back to whatever city she'd come from. She'd returned most of the jewelry and established a payment plan for the rest, though I honestly doubted I'd ever see much of that money. But it wasn't really about the money anyway. It was about establishing that actions have consequences and that taking advantage of someone's trust comes with a price. My children and I are rebuilding our relationship slowly. There's still hurt on both sides, still work to be done, but we're doing it honestly now, without the fiction that I'm some fragile old woman who needs to be managed for her own good. Lillian calls me twice a week, and we're planning a trip to Ireland together next spring. Michael brings his kids over every other Sunday, and we're teaching them to garden. I think about Thomas sometimes, about the man I thought I was married to versus the man who actually shared my bed for 43 years. I think about how easy it must have been for him to justify his choices, how simple it must have seemed to keep both lives running parallel without considering what it was costing me. I think about whether I should have seen it coming, whether there were signs I missed or ignored, but mostly, I think about how close I came to disappearing entirely, how easily everyone around me had been willing to let that happen. How, if I hadn't been the kind of woman who keeps careful financial records and understands legal documents, I might have found myself homeless and destitute, while my husband's girlfriend lived in the house I'd helped pay for with the money I'd helped save. I learned something important through all of this, that love without respect is just elaborate exploitation, and that being someone's wife for 4 decades doesn't protect you from being treated like their servant when it becomes convenient. I learned that family members will choose sides based on who they think has more power or who they think will be easier to manage, and that being the good woman who never causes trouble can sometimes mean being the woman everyone feels safe betraying. But I also learned that I'm stronger than anyone gave me credit for, including myself. That 43 years of marriage taught me more about managing money, understanding legal documents, and navigating complex situations than anyone realized. That being underestimated can actually be an advantage when you're ready to fight back. These days, I wake up in my own house, in my own bed, surrounded by things I chose for myself. I make decisions based on what I want rather than what would be most convenient for other people. I've stopped being the woman who accommodates everyone else's needs at the expense of her own dignity. And when my phone rings and someone starts a conversation with that careful, gentle tone that means they're about to tell me something they think I won't understand or handle well, I interrupt them politely but firmly. "Let me stop you right there," I say. "I'm much stronger and much smarter than you think I am. Now, what exactly are you trying to tell me?" It's amazing how that simple change in approach has affected every relationship in my life. Amazing how much respect you gain when you make it clear that you expect to be treated with respect. Amazing how much better life becomes when you stop accepting less than you deserve, just to keep the peace. The woman in the black Chanel suit at Thomas's funeral thought she was taking over my life. What she actually did was give me the gift of clarity, the painful but necessary understanding that I'd been living in a beautiful illusion while everyone around me had been managing the ugly reality without my knowledge. She thought she was inheriting a life of comfort and security, stepping into shoes that had been kept warm for her by a man who'd promised her everything that was mine. Instead, she discovered that promises made by married men to their mistresses aren't worth the breath used to speak them, and that the real world operates according to laws and documents, rather than romantic fantasies and whispered assurances. My children thought they were honoring their father's wishes and managing a difficult transition with minimal conflict. What they actually did was show me exactly how little they thought of their mother's intelligence, strength, and right to be treated as an equal participant in her own life story. They learned that treating someone like a burden eventually makes you the burden, and that underestimating someone for 43 years doesn't mean they'll stay underestimated forever. Thomas thought he could have everything: the stability and financial security of our marriage, the excitement and romance of his affair, the love and respect of his children, and a peaceful death surrounded by people who would honor his memory exactly as he wanted it honored. He thought he was clever enough to orchestrate all of this without consequences, that he could rewrite our history to make himself the hero and me the gracious supporting character who would fade quietly into the background when her part in the story was over. But Thomas forgot something important. He forgot that I was a real person with my own intelligence, my own resources, my own legal rights, and my own capacity for strategic thinking. He forgot that being married to someone for 43 years means they know things about you too, including how terrible you are with money and how little you actually understand about the legal and financial structures that govern married life. Most importantly, he forgot that love isn't something you can take for granted, indefinitely, and that respect isn't something you can withdraw from someone and then expect them to keep giving it back to you. He forgot that every relationship is built on reciprocity, and that when you stop holding up your end of that bargain, the other person eventually notices and starts making different choices. The funeral was 6 months ago now, and I can see it more clearly than I could in those first shocking weeks. I can see that it wasn't just about Thomas's betrayal or Celeste's presumption or my children's poor judgment. It was about a whole system of assumptions that had grown up around me over the years. Assumptions about what I would tolerate, what I would accept, how much I could be asked to sacrifice for other people's comfort and convenience. Everyone had gotten so accustomed to my accommodation, my flexibility, my willingness to put other people's needs first, that they'd forgotten I was a person with needs and feelings and rights of my own. I'd become like a piece of furniture in my own life, useful, reliable, taken for granted, and assumed to be there whenever anyone needed me, but not particularly considered when decisions were being made about how the room should be arranged. The wake-up call was brutal but necessary, because the alternative, the path I was being guided toward, would have been a slow fade into irrelevance, a gradual erasure from my own story until I became just a minor character in other people's narratives. I would have ended up in some small apartment, living on some modest allowance, being visited occasionally by children who saw me as a duty rather than a person, spending my final years as a cautionary tale about women who don't stand up for themselves when it matters most. Instead, I'm writing my own ending. I'm living in a house I chose, making decisions based on my own preferences, building relationships with people who see me as I actually am rather than as who they need me to be for their own convenience. I'm discovering parts of myself that got buried during all those years of marriage, all those decades of putting Thomas's needs and my children's needs ahead of my own growth and happiness. It's not a revenge story, despite what it might have looked like from the outside. It's a recovery story, the story of a woman who almost lost herself entirely, but found her way back just in time to save her own life. It's the story of learning that kindness without boundaries becomes enabling, that love without respect becomes exploitation, and that loyalty without reciprocity becomes servitude. And it's the story of discovering that it's never too late to remember who you are underneath all the roles other people have assigned to you, and that the most radical thing you can do sometimes is simply refuse to disappear when everyone around you has decided it would be more convenient if you did. The woman in the black Chanel suit learned that stealing someone else's life is harder than it looks. I learned that reclaiming your own life is easier than you think once you decide you're worth the fight.